As we discussed yesterday, the Gemara postulates a principle called Esei Docha Losas. And in the case of Yibum, the Gemara wants to apply that in the Havamina before the pasuk Leha that excludes Yibum in the case of an Erva to Yibum in the case of any of the 15 Arayos. And we added a little piece of logic yesterday that if the Torah overrides the Erva of Eishes Ach for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum, then so too the Torah would override the other Isurei Yibum. We had a long discussion yesterday about the fact that there doesn't seem to be a possibility of a kiyum mitzvah of Yibum if Yibum means a kinyan, because Ein Kiddushin Tosim Ba Chayev Arayos. And we gave the answer to Chemdas Shlomo. We added the answer of Shimon Shkop, different formulations. Now we want to introduce a question of the Tosefes Yom Kippur. And he says, wait a minute, the mitzvah of Yibum is only a mitzvah incumbent on the Yavam. It's not incumbent upon the Yavama. And the pasuk itself proves it. It says, Yavama Yavo Elevam. So the Torah is addressing itself to the Yavam. Now, the Isar Erva applies to both him and her. There's no difference between his violation and hers. In both, we're going to have a Chiv Kares, or in some Arayos, a Chiv Misa. And the Torah says, V'nichrasu hanefashos ha'osos, referring to both he and she. Now, if the essay of Yibum is only incumbent upon him, it means that she doesn't have the mitzvah of Yibum. And in that sense, how could his mitzvah of Yibum override the Isser Erva that's incumbent upon her? And the only possible answer, says the Tosfos Yom Kippur, to this problem, the only way out, is to assume that if you have a mitzvah say that's incumbent upon one person, but he can only fulfill that mitzvah say with the partnership of another person, then that other person also will be included in the process of dechia. The process of dechia of Esei Docha Losas will apply not only to the individual who is obligated in the mitzvah, but even to the individual with whom he has to fulfill the mitzvah, even though that person is not obligated in the mitzvah. And in the language of the Tosfos Yom Kippurim, Kol mitzvah saseh al adam echad shemutal olav lasosa b'tzavta, which means in conjunction in acher with somebody else, harei ha-mitzvah docha af es halav shel chaver. So that if the Yavam is obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum, his essay can now override the losaseh of the Yavama, even though she doesn't have the essay, but only because his essay entails her participation. There's no way that he can fulfill his mitzvah say without her. And therefore, she can also override the lotaseh that's incumbent upon her by virtue of the essay that's incumbent upon him. And this is I would call it the revolution of the Tosfos Yom Kippurim, who sees no other way of explaining our Gemara. There's no other possible way of explaining our Gemara unless you postulate that the Esei Docha Losas applies to her as well, despite the fact that she's not obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. And that's pretty way out. And this is what we got up to yesterday. Today, we want to study the insights of Rabbi Akiva Eger, who is later than the Tosfos. And he quotes a Tosfos in Masechet Gittin on Daf Mem Aleph. And Tosfos is going to present two opinions about this issue that we're dealing with today. The sugya there in Gittin is addressing the case of what's called a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chor, and whether or not he can marry a Bas Chor. And as you know, just to review the basics, in the case of an Eved, if he has a relationship with a Bas Chor, that's a violation of a Lav Da'oraisa, because the Torah prohibits a Jewish girl from having a relationship with an Eved. And now here's the issue. He's a Chatzi Ben Chorin, so that half of him Right. Well, just again, just the basics. There's an Isser Kedesha, and Kedesha applies whenever a Jewish man has a relationship with a Shivcha or a Jewish woman with an Eved. Now, if let's say there are two partners that own and share ownership on an Eved, if one of the two he delivers a get shichrur, and the other insists on maintaining his grip, so to speak, his ownership, his possession over the Eved, mitzad, the master who freed him, is a chatzi ben chorin, and he's obligated in all the mitzvahs, but half of him is still an Eved because the other partner did not release him and deliver get shichrur. So he's in a complex status of Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin. The half of him that is a Ben Chorin is obligated in the midst of period Verivia. The half of him that's an Eved is enjoined from the mitzvah period Verivia with the Bas Chorin. He cannot fulfill this mitzvah because in doing so, he would violate the Isser of Kedeshah. However, we have a principle called Esei Docha Los Aseh. And Tosas wants to know, can we allow a Bas Chorin to marry this Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin, facilitating the Chatzi Ben Chorin's Kiyum HaMitzvah period review, but at the same time overriding the lotus of Kedeshus. The problem is she is not obligated in the mitzvah period review. He's obligated in the mitzvah period. And Tosas wants to know, do we apply the principle of Esei Docha Losas to allow this Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin to marry a Bas Chorin? The Gemara says explicitly that we don't allow it. The only thing that we could hope for is to force the other owner, the other master, to free and release his ownership over the Eved to make him a full-fledged Ben Chorin. But in the absence of that happening, the Chatzi Eved Shabo is now going to block the possibility of Pir V'Rivya and will make it impossible, according to Allah. It's absolutely awesome for her, a Bas Chorin, to marry the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin. And he's in a situation where he can't fulfill his mitzvah as a Ben Chorin, a Chatzi Ben Chorin of Pir V'Rivya. Because who's going to marry? He can't marry Shivcha because that would be a violation of the law of Shivchas. He can't marry Bas Chorin because she is enjoined from marrying him insofar as he's a Chatzi Eved. And Tosas raises the question, why is the Gemara so upset about this? Why does the Gemara say we have to force the Adon to free his half of the Eved? Why not allow the Eved, insofar as he's a Chatzi Ben Chorin, to marry a Bas Chorin? He's a Chatzi Eved, and there'll be a violation of the Isur Shivchus. We're going to apply the principle of Esei Docha Losas. And Tosas offers three answers to this question. We're going to focus on one of the three. In the sequence, the last of the three is that the essay of period Verivia cannot override the lotus of Kedeshah because only he is obligated in the mitzvah period. She is alleviated from the mitzvah period. So she doesn't have an essay to override the Easter of Shivchos, the Easter of Kedeshus, if she marries a Chatzi Eved. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, from this third answer of Tosas, you see clearly that the Tosas Yom Kippurim is not correct. Tosas is not willing to say what the Tosas Yom Kippurim would say, that since he has the essay, and the only way he could fulfill the essay is with her partnership, therefore we can be Docha Har Iser, even though she's not obligated to the essay. Here you see that Tosas in his third answer insists that the reason why the only option here to facilitate period Verivia on behalf of the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin is to force the other Adon to free his half. And we cannot apply the principle of Esei Docha Losas because she doesn't have the essay period Verivia. That is an open contradiction to the Tosas Yom Kippur. However, says Rabbi Kiva, the ball game is not over. All is not lost because there are two other answers in Tosas. And those two answers in Tosas were not satisfied with the third answer in Tosas. The first two answers in Tosas maintain that Esei Dochalo says should apply. And this despite the fact that she is not obligated in the mitzvah period for if she doesn't have an essay. It must be that those two first answers of Tosas accepted the underlying principle of the Tosas Yom Kippurim, that it's enough for him to be chayiv in the essay, to be docha halav, even when she's not obligated in the essay. Okay. Now, given the fact that there is one, the last of three answers in Tosas and Gittin, that essay docha losasa will not apply in a case where he's obligated in the essay and she's not, then how does that answer Tosas square with our sugya that applies essay docha losasa in the case of Yibum with an erfa when he's obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum and she's not? After all, the Torah says Yevamot Yavo Olel. He is obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. She's not. And we're holding now, according to the third answer, Tosas there in Gittin with regard to Chatziyah and Chatzim Chorin, that we cannot apply. We have to suspend the principle of essay docha losa if the essay is on him and not on her, because she has the losa set, and there's no essay on her part to override the losa. So what are we going to do with our sugya of Yibum? Says Rabbi Kiva, so if Loma, we have no choice but to assume shegam hayivama mitzuva al Yibum. Interesting. From that third answer in Tosas and Gittin, we're going to derive the conclusion that at least according to that sheet in Tosas, not only is he obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum, but likewise she is obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. Hence, the Gemara is justified by applying essay docha losaseh, because both he and she are obligated in the essay of Yibum. So she could be docha hola, her Yisrael erfa, because of her mitzvah of Yibum. Now, just think about this for a moment philosophically. It's very interesting. Chalitza and Yibum are two choices in the hands of the Yavam. He makes that decision, deciding whether he wants Yibum or Chalitza, irrespective of her. He's not going to call her up and say, well, what's your preference? He's going to make that decision. He's got two roads in front of him and two alternatives. And yet, the mitzvah of Yibum is hard. It's very strange. For example, he can decide he wants to give a Chalitza, which makes it impossible for her to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum. I mean, just in the concept of Beinonim L'Chavero, it's a very peculiar construct in which one person is in control of the mitzvah of another person, which means that he, the Yavam, could veto the mitzvah, the kiyuma mitzvah of the Isha, Yevama, in the mitzvah of Yibum. So again, what we're going to see here unfolding in front of our eyes is a bunch of achronim, a very significant group of achronim who understood that the mitzvah of Yibum is incumbent upon him, the Yavama Yavolel, and not on her. And on the other side of the scale, we have Rabbi Kiva. Now, I'm not telling you that Rabbi Kiva is a slouch. He's he's pretty important. But basically, he is the minority view here in this whole conflict. And in fact, even Rabbi Kiva is only presenting this principle, or this conclusion, if you will, based on the third of three answers of Tosfos and Gittin to the problem, why is there no essay dochalosas in the case of Chatzi Ev and Chatzi Bekor? So Rabbi Akiva himself is relying on a minority opinion. And he admits that the other two answers in Tosfos never accepted this principle. But because we have that third answer of Tosfos, that we cannot apply essay dochalosas if she's not obligated, and yet our Gemara here in Masechet Yevamot Gimel and Beis applies essay dochalosas in the case of Yibum with an Erev. We have no choice, as Rabbi Akiva, but to assume and derive the conclusion that that answer in Tosfos must have understood logically. There's no other mathematical solution to this problem, that she, like him, like he, is obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. A very, if I could say it, a tenuous position, but a no-choice conclusion. And in fact, the Minchas Chinuch quotes the Lashon Rambam in Yibum for Chalitza, Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph, and it seems clearly that from the Rambam that the entire mitzvah is incumbent upon the Yavam and not the Yevamot. Says the Minchas Chinuch, the Chinuch himself in the mitzvah of Yibum implies quite clearly. I mean, it's almost explicit that the mitzvah of Yibum is incumbent upon him. So we have now, if we line up the who's list, we've got the Rambam, we have the Sefer Chinuch, two Rishonim, we have the Tosefes Yom Kippurim, we have the Minchas Chinuch. They all agree that the mitzvah of Yibum is incumbent upon he and not she. Now we have an Avudraham, just to add, fuel to the fire over here, because he quotes one of the Rishonim. He himself was a Rishon, by the way, a very late Rishon, 6 centuries ago. But he quotes an earlier Rishon, the Ri ben Pala, who says, Ein ha'isha mitzuva l'yibum. But the logic of the Ri Pala is very compelling. And he says, what's the purpose of Yibum if not to bring a child into it? Well, let's go back to the original marriage, to Shimon, who unfortunately passed away without children. Was his wife obligated to bring a child into the world? The mitzvah period of Rebbe is incumbent upon him and not on her. So now you're going to tell me that Yibum, which is the next generation, next link in bringing a child into the world, is all of a sudden we're going to invite the Yevama and say that she's obligated in this mitzvah. She wasn't obligated in the original marriage, and now she's going to be obligated in the second marriage, in the Yibum situation. Furthermore, he says, we have a hekesh between Yibum and Chalitza, and it's all part of one mitzvah. She's not obligated in Chalitza. He's obligated in Chalitza. So likewise, he's obligated in Yibum. I'm just trying to impress you. I don't know. You don't seem very impressed. Maybe it's because of the Zoom or something. I don't know. But I'm trying to impress you that there's so much evidence here that the mitzvah of Yibum is his and not hers. And I'm not trying to undercut Rabbi Akiva. I have a great deal of awe and respect for Rabbi Akiva. He was one of the greatest minds in the Ashkenazic world in the last 3 centuries, probably.
But his life doesn't change. He does Yibum or he doesn't do Yibum or his life is not impacting at all. Her life is tremendously impacted. It seems like
unfair.
It's unfair that she has standing in it happening. I mean, she could force him to either do Yibum or Chalitza. He has to have some
say in the matter,
right?
And yet the ball is in his court, and yet she's the one who's going to really be impacted by this marriage. Well, you know what? We're going to see later, Steve. I don't want to be makdim as some uchar that if she refuses to be miyabim, then I think again I don't know all the details because that's a sugya later on. Then I think we compel him to give a chalitza. But you're right. There is a moral issue here that has to be dealt with on a philosophical level. I mean, I would even ask the following question. I don't know if you relate to this question. Isn't it paradoxical that a woman is not obligated to have children, and yet she's the one who's going to go through childbirth? It seems very strange. But again, I'm just saying that the evidence here weighs in to the conclusion of the Tosas Yom Kippur that a woman is not obligated in the midst of Yibum. Again, he therefore jumps to the next conclusion that we can still apply Esei Docha Losas based on the fact that he's obligated in the midst of Yibum. And that's a fascinating idea that she can be Docha or Lav of Arias for the sake of his mitzvah of Yibum. And Tosas and Yevamos, in one answer at least, just completely rejects that concept. She is going to marry a Chatzi Evet, says Tosas, because of his mitzvah period review. What are you talking about? She doesn't have a mitzvah period review. What's going to be Docha Har Isur Kadeshus when she has a marriage relationship with an Evet, a Chatzi Evet? And in the light of that sheet of Tosfos, that Esei Dochalosa just doesn't work over here. But Kivega says we have no choice but to assume that she, like he, is obligated in the mitzvah of Eve, which, as I said, is it's a real stretch, given all the arguments and the logic. It's the pasuk itself. He's addressing him and not her. I mean, personally, I would be much happier if we had another resolution to our sugya of Esei Dochel. So without assuming that she's obligated in the mitzvah, but without going as far as like Purim and undermining that third answer in the Tosfos Kin and saying, well, he's obligated. Here I would ask another question. My Rebbe always differentiated between a chiyuv and a kiyuv, meaning you can have a mitzvah which is incumbent and obligatory on, we'll call it Mr. X, and Mr. Y is not obligated, but if he opts voluntarily to fulfill that mitzvah, he gets brownie points. He has a kiyuv mitzvah, a fulfillment of mitzvah without a chiyuv. That's kind of like the middle ground. I would call it the twilight zone between chiyuv and reshus. Reshus means it's power. I come home at night, my wife says, what do you want to eat? Do you want chicken or you want meat? That's power. That's a reshus. But in the middle between reshus and chova, you can have, like, for example, it could be mayim achronim. I'm not getting into the sugya of mayim achronim, but it could be the mayim achronim is an optional mitzvah. And if you decide to go for it, you get a kiyum mitzvah. You're not obligated. Could be that again, since this is complicated, but could be that there are mitzvahs where you're not obligated, but you get a kiyum mitzvah. Rabbeinu Tam, for example, goes far and says that women are allowed to make a bracha on a mitzvah sasei shazman grama that they fulfill voluntarily. Why? Because there's a kiyum mitzvah without a chiyuv mitzvah. Could we apply that distinction to him and her in Yibum? He's obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. She's not. But both will have a kiyum mitzvah of Yibum. Would that open up a Pesach, a possible way of reconciling our sugya with Tosfos? Let's just think. If she's marrying a Chatzi Evet, Tosfos says we cannot apply Esei Dochel. Yeah, but the only way I can even begin to think about this and raise it as a possibility is if we're going to say and that's against the Abu that period of Arivia, she doesn't even have a kiyum on this. Totally his mitzvah, from A to Z. But in the case of Yibum, he has a kiyum on this. That's enough. Then we go on to say that would be enough for Esek. Nah. It's what we call dog fetishka. Just get it. I'm thinking out loud. Maybe, so let's say Rabbi Kivega. Rabbi Kivega holds that the mitzvah, according to that day in Tosfos, of Yibum is incumbent on her. Even though he has to admit that in the first round, when she was married to Shimon, the late Shimon, right, when she was married to him, she was exempt from the mitzvah period. And now she takes on a mitzvah of Yibum, according to Rabbi Kivega. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But maybe the answer is that as long as Shimon is alive, the Torah dumps it on him, so to speak. It's all the obligations are incumbent on him. He's got to do whatever he can, and she can't oppose him, but she's not participating in that mitzvah because he's alone. Now, what happens with the Zikas Yibum is a new mitzvah emerges of Lahakim Shem Li'achiv. Shimon is obviously, he's gone. He cannot in any way bring a child into this world. He is going to be now picking up his mitzvah of period Verivia, so to speak. As long as he was alive, we have a target. You dump it all on him. She doesn't have an obligation. She's passed. Once he's out of the picture, and the Torah wants to see from that marriage and from Shimon a child coming into the world, the Torah now picks who's left here. I mean, he's gone, she's left him. And the zika of the original marriage is now reflected in the relation between her and the Yavam. And both the Yavam and her now have to pick up Ki'ilu, Shimon's mitzvah period. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. But maybe it's feasible to say that even though she doesn't have period of Rivia, she does have a mitzvah of Yibum. Now, the Minchas Chinuch wants to ask the following question. We have the Tosfos Yom HaKippurim, and the question is, how could she participate in Yibum in the case of an Ereva? After all, she's not included in the essay. How could his mitzvah of Yibum be docha har isur? Says the Minchas Chinuch, she's not obligated in the law. What does that mean? This is a brilliant chiddush. He says, you're right. There's no essay to be doche the losas. But that losas begins with him and ends with her. If we can remove the losas of him by virtue of essay doche, because he has the essay, then memela, the losas on her is removed. Ikar alav nemar ala ish eliyesh ribui the af nashim asuros. So the Isha is a derivative. It's not an original. When the pasuk is read straightforward, it always addresses him. He's not allowed to have a relationship with an Erev. Once he's included in the Isur, we have a ribui of kol hanafashos to include her. V'alkein einon musharos el b'makom shel ish mushar. Her Isur Lav, insofar as it's an extension or a derivative of his Isur Lav, can only apply when he is Asur in the Lav. His Azhara, his prohibition now encompasses her as well. But if his prohibition doesn't exist, then Mamela, she doesn't have the prohibition. The Nidcha Isuro, he has the mitzvah say of Yibum that overrides his Isur, is Af Himuteres. She is also included under that head. So that we don't have to come to the radical conclusion and of the Tosas Yom Kippurim and make a universal bombastic statement that whenever you have A who needs B, and A is chayv with the mitzvah and B is not, then the dechia on A will now override the losa sefer B. No, we don't have to go that far. We have to talk about our rayos and specifically hone in our rayos. Here we have a halacha that her Isur Lav is a derivative. It's not an original. And if the original is removed, the derivative is removed. Now let's just see if that works out according to Tos's last answer, Gittin. In the case of Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, he has the essay of period of Rivya to be docha the lav of Kedeshus. I think what we're going to have to add here, we'll see if he mentions anything. He has a footnote here. No, I don't think he addresses it in a minute. We're going to have to add, I think, the following. That the Isur Kedeshus, which is a two-way street, meaning the Eved is not allowed to marry a Bas Chorin. A Bas Chorin cannot marry an Eved. He's not allowed to marry a Shivcha, and a Shivcha can't be married to him. In this case, of the Lav of Kedeshus, the Isur is equally incumbent upon both of them. It's not that she is a derivative. And it makes sense because the Torah doesn't allow a Kedesha into Israel. And the Torah is really, in a sense, giving her a status. In Arayos, it's a two-way street. The Torah is talking about, he's married to her, and now he wants to have a relationship with her sister, etc., etc. But in the case of Kedeshus, the Torah is really addressing her status as a Kedesha. She's a Shivcha. And having a relationship with the Shivcha, the Torah's perspective, is a pollution of sorts. It's a contamination. So Mamela, just to make the calculation, according to Tosas and Gittin, we cannot apply essay dochalosas in the case of a Chatzi Eved because his essay is not incumbent upon her. So if he wants to marry Bas Chorin, she is enjoined without an essay from getting married to a Chatzi Eved. And her situation here is not a derivative. Masha Einkein, in the case of Arayos, the Isur is being addressed by the Torah to the Boel, to the man, and the status of an Isha vis-a-vis these Isurim is a derivative. If he is not included in the Isur for whatever reason, then Mamela, she's not included as well. I mean, let's say, for example, a Kohen is enjoined from marrying a Zona, a Chalola, a Grusha. If I find a situation, now wait a second, she can't marry him either if she's any of those three, if she's a Zona, Grusha, Chalola. However, if we find a scenario in which the Kohen would be allowed to marry a Zona, then even if that reasoning, that powerful force would not apply to her, she would still be allowed to marry, despite the fact that she's a Zona, Grusha, Chalol. Why? Because her Isser is no doubt a derivative of his. She's not a Kohen. The Torah is addressing the Kohen. She's not allowed to have a relationship with him because she is therefore involved in, so to speak, desecrating the sanctity of Kahuna. But that's the sanctity of Kahuna is his, not hers. If there's one loophole, and in certain situations he's allowed to marry his own, etc., she'd be allowed to marry him as well. Even if you would convince me that the reason for him, like he has an essay to be docha the losa, so it would not apply to her, be irrelevant. I'm just giving you a mashal of dome, the logic here of the Minchas Chinuch. I call it the derivative logic. A derivative is only valid if the original is still active, it's still intact, it's chal. When you remove the original, is memela, the derivative is gone. A very powerful. I mean, honestly, I've been studying methodology for a long time. My wife is trying to push me to publish on this, but I don't remember encountering this kind of a structure in the world of Londis. To me, it's very original. I'm sure it has its power. I think the Rav once said that Reb Chaim had very few achronim on his desk. One of them was the Minchas Chinuch. Okay. Now we go on to another dimension of this Esei Dochalosas enterprise. The Torah, when it talks about Gili Arayos, uses the phrase Kreva Arayos, Lo Sikravu Leisha Legalos Ervasa. And here we have a machlokas, a major debate between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Ramban says that Lo Sikravu Legalos Erva really should be translated as the act itself. Don't come close to a woman who's an erva to you in order to implement the act, the Maaseh Bid. And all the harchakos that we know about that could have been defined as Lo Sikravu, according to the Ramban, they're all D'Rabbanan. However, the Rambam disagrees. And the Rambam in Ilchilchas Isurei Bia establishes that Krevel Arayos is D'Oraisa. It's not a Chiyuv Kares or a Chiyuv Misa, but you get Malchus for it. I mean, to give perhaps a dramatic or example of this distinction, there's something called Tchilas Bia and Sof Bia. It could be, again, I don't know, we're not learning the sugya now, but it could be that in order to violate Gili Arayos, you need Sof Bia, but Tchilas Bia itself would be enough, according to the Rambam, to generate Malchus. Let's say he would withdraw after Tchilas Bia, he would still get Malchus for violating the Lav D'Oraisa Lo Sikravu. Are you with me so far? But you know what? I just want to go back to read footnote number Mem Gimel, which I never read. It says, "Tzarich im b'dvarav ha'im bo liyashiv es kushas harei somach es mekoro v'divrei ha'gemara la'alon peidalim v'beis v'lo nemar shom kain el in nashim ha'psulos l'kuna." Oh, my example from Kahuna was not bad. I was on the right track. Daf hein muzharos al isu zeh Mirechtiv lo yikhu. Ulechora ein mis yasheves bekach ela kucha midivrei hagemara alon daf chafam beis v'chai bilam kon almona mina erisin lekoin gadol aval hakusha mishum sunyan eich salpitaitel sheis yavnu arayov midin esei dochalosas L'chora b'eino medish harei b'isur ha'rais l'mutzinu she'isur ha'isha toli b'isur ha'ish. So he writes a footnote here, which I disagree with, but he's saying, I don't understand. The sugya says that in Kahuna, her isur is a derivative. She's psula laguna, zona, chalola, and grusha. But here, in the isur of harayos, who says that the isur of an isha is a derivative? In fact, what the Minchas Chinuch says, whether you like it or not. Truth be told, the Ben Chaskina could not base himself on that sugya later on in the page, when the Gemara discusses Psule Kahuna, because that might be a special issue with her. Easter is a derivative because the Chil Kedushas Kuna is his business, not hers. Whereas Arias is a two-way street, it takes two to tango. But nevertheless, the Gemara Bava Kama derives her Easter and Erva from the Nichritzu Nefashos, from the plural word Nefashos. So that's a derivative. I would write a letter to the editor. All right. Anyway, so getting back to the Kasha of the Shar HaMelech. The Shar HaMelech, one of the outstanding commentaries on the Rambam. How could the Rambam say that if you violate Krevel Arayos, the Rambam at the very beginning of Perikov Alf B'machavek v'menashek achas me'arayos over below sikru legalos erev v'loker. As I said, the Ramban disagrees. That's the Shar HaMelech. We have a principle, a limitation, regulation, a rule in Esei Dochalosa called Be'idna. Be'idna means simultaneity. The violation of the lav and the fulfillment of the essay are simultaneous. If, on the other hand, you first violate the lav, and then subsequently, at time T1, you violate the lav, and at time T2, you fulfill the essay, we cannot apply the principle of essay dophalosis. That's all over the place. We're going to have to understand how essay dophalosa applies to shviras etzem of the Korban Pesach, because the achila and the mitzvah of eating the marrow inside is only fulfilled after he breaks the bone. How does that fit into Be'idna? But again, that's a different discussion. So now, asks the Shar HaMelech, even before he fulfills the mitzvah of Yibum, he violates the lav of Krevel Arayos, which is the lav Sheish Bo Malchus. What essay is going to override the Krevel Arayos? Again, it doesn't mean that he kissed her or he hugged her. Forget about that. But Chilas Bia is already certainly, without any shadow of a doubt, according to the Rambam Shita, a violation of the lav of Krevel Arayos Sikru. He gets Malchus for that. And yet, the mitzvah of Yibum would only be fulfilled with Sof Bia. Now, I'm not sure if that's biological because she can't get pregnant unless, there's a penetration and the zera has to go. I don't know if you have to go into that now. Let's leave that for the biologists. But the premise is, and the Gemara assumes this all over the place, that the mitzvah of Yibum cannot be fulfilled until Sof Bia. Already B'tchilas Bia, he's violating, according to the Rambam Shita, the lav of Lo Sikru. And you cannot apply Esei Dochalosas unless it's Be'idna. The fact that in time T2, he will fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum, when in time T1, he's already violating a lav. How could you override that lav? Again, a brilliant kasha of the Shar HaMelech. If anyone's looking for a sugya to see how wealthy the Torah is, this is an excellent choice. In Kain Hech Yitcha Esei Yibum Es HaKrevel Arayos Ad Habia Atzma Halo Be'idna Dinekar Alav Hadayin Lo Is Kayima Esei. And if you look at the last line in the footnote, but I don't know, yours didn't come out, but he says She'em Is Kayemes Mitzvahs Yibum El Bakomas Shem Li Ochiv Shehi B'Gmar Bi. Val v'imkein yikshe l'shitas harambam alo be'idna to be ekar lav da'hayu ha'ara is the word for tchilas bia adayin lo his kayim ha'esed. the truth is that, I mean, he's going to quote the Imrei Moshe, we'll see, but even before we get to the Imrei Moshe, when you talk about mitzvahs, there's a narrow definition of a mitzvah and there's a broader definition. It's impossible to reach sof bia without chilas bia. So what are we going to say? That since the mitzvah of Yibum could only be fulfilled with sof bia, that means that chilas bia is not part of the mitzvah? I'll give you an example. The Gemara in Bava Kama says that if I find a talus and I'm required to shake out the talus and air it out, because otherwise it's going to get, again, I don't know how to translate this into English, fashimel. How would you say that in English? But you know what I mean. If you don't air out clothing, then after a while, it gets all fashtuk. And the Gemara says that the status of the finder is that of a shomer sachar. Why? Because if an ani comes knocking on the door while he's being menayar the talus, he doesn't have to bother with the ani, and he saves himself some money, and that's considered a shomer sachar, as if he's getting paid for a shmir. It's a sugya of Rabba and Rava in the Perek HaKodesh. I don't get it. The Gemara is assuming osek b'mitzvah, patim in the mitzvah. What do you mean osek b'mitzvah? The Torah says return an aveda. So you're in the process of shaking out a talus so that you can return the aveda that's still intact. It hasn't gotten spoiled, disintegrated, etc., etc. Why is that osek b'mitzvah, patim in the mitzvah? In fact, the Gemara in Sukkah says that if you're on your way to be makabel pnei rabo b'regel yipotim min sukkah. Right, you're taking a trek. Your rebbe is in the next town over, and it's sukkahs, and you'll be makayim the mitzvah makabel pnei rabo b'regel. And the Gemara says you don't have to build a sukkah on the way. Why? Because osek b'mitzvah potim min mitzvah. Sukkah chafei. What do you mean osek b'mitzvah? I'm on my way. I'm on a train to go from Warsaw to Bialystok to be makabel pnei rabo during Chol HaMoed Sukkot. That's considered osek b'mitzvah. So we see, Rabbosai, that there are broader definitions of a mitzvah. I think that's more or less what I'm hoping we're going to get out of the Imrei Moshe as we see it here on page Yutes. But first, let's introduce the Beis HaLevi. This Beis HaLevi is very reminiscent of the concept, the construct, I would say, methodology of the Minchas Chinuch that we saw before, what I call derivative. The Beis HaLevi, Ein krevel arayos asura el mishum siad bia. In other words, the Isur Lav of krevel arayos, according to the Rambam, is a derivative. It's a derivative of the Isur bia. And that's how the Rambam learns the Pasuk, Sikravu, because through kreva, legalos erv, you'll come to bia mamash. Therefore, im osid li dachos Isur abia mibnei ha'esei sheba af hakreva lo nesra. Since the Isur of kreva is a derivative of bia, and we know that at the moment of bia, or call it Gemar bia, he will fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum, and therefore will apply the principle of Esei Docha Losas. So we can already apply the principle of Esei Docha Losas to the kreva, because the kreva could not be asur if the bia is not going to be asur. The problem I have with this Beis HaLevi is a chronological problem. I don't understand the chronology of it. At the moment that he violates the Isur kreva, what essay is going to be docha this lav? So Beis HaLevi says, no, there's no essay to be docha the lav, because the essay is postponed until Gemar bia. But the fact that the essay will eventually, down the line override the losase, therefore there's no losas that already neutralizes the Isa Kreva because Kreva is got to beer and the beer itself will be mutter. But I don't understand how you can say that at stage one and already in the initial process consider the Isa lav of Kreva to be awesome. I mean, say to be mutter. Why is it mutter? Because beer will be mutter. At this moment in time, I'm not ready for beer or Gemar beer. I'm facing the lav of Lo Sikru. And I don't have the fear because there's no essay of Hebrew. And the Beis Halevi will blow me away and blow me off the thing. It'll say, you're not saying anything. Why? Because you can only apply the lav of Lo Sikru in a case where it will not culminate in a biasura. And here it will culminate in a bia she'ena asura because of the essay of Hebrew. The mele, the lav meikaro doesn't get off the ground because in this scenario, the lav itself could not be a preliminary of the avera bia because the bia itself is muteris. Again, this is not similar to a case of a pnuya. All right, you have to know whether the Rambam's lav applies to a pnuya or not. I have to open up the Rambam and investigate. Let's assume, just theoretically, there would be a lav in the case of a pnuya. He can't say that he's going to marry her and he's going to have a head to bia, therefore he's allowed already be miscarried, kreva, and chibuk v'nisha because he's going to marry a lady. I mean, that'd be pretty cool, right? Let's take the Beis Halevi. This what I'm about to say is absolutely ridiculous, but look at it this way: a single boy with a single girl, and he intends to marry her. Is he allowed to kiss her and hug her? I don't know if this would add anything. Maybe if let's say she's a nida, so for sure there would be an Issa Kreva. There are a lot of ins and outs of them. So that's not a cash on the Beis Halevi because the marriage relationship is a whole new entity. In other words, now his kreva is a kreva le'iser bia. It's true that he has a possibility. It's not like the case of Yavam. In Yavam, he doesn't need a kedushin. He doesn't have to change the cards on the table, on the deck. All he needs is beer. He needs bar beer. So the kreva cannot be prohibited because the Gemara Bia will be mutter. In the case of Kedusha, that's a whole new entity. Okay, let's see if we can get the Imre Moshe. You know what? I just want to think about one point of it. I'm sorry. We're not yet ready for the Imre Moshe. So we're on the last paragraph now on page Yud Ches. And we're going to study the Shar Hamel, which we quoted earlier. He asked the Kasha, there's no Be'idna here because according to the Rambam, there's Krevel Arayos. So he quotes a Ran in Bab Metzia. And he says, Lule miut hakosuv, haisam mitzvahs hashavas aveda dochel lav shel tumas kohen. A kohen, in order to obtain a lost object and return it to his owner, is theoretically allowed to go into a Beis HaKfaros. The lost animal, let's say, roamed into a cemetery. And the Gemara Bab Metzia is going to apply the principle of Esei Dochalosis. And the Ran asks the obvious question, what do you mean, Esei Dochalosis? In the very moment he steps into the Beis HaKfaros, and he's a Kohen, he violated the Isser of Tumas Kohen. His mitzvah of Achshavatz Aveda will not be fulfilled until later on. He's got to pick up the Aveda, he's got to find its owner, identify and return it, etc., etc. So how could the Gemara apply Esei Dochalosas in the case of a Kohen going into a Beis HaKvaros in order to return an Aveda? Where's the Be'idna? Says the Ran, Kolshu misasek b'mitzvah. Please underline the word misasek b'mitzvah. That's what I think is our case over there, where he shakes the talis, or he's on his way to be Makabel Pnei Rabbah. That's called his askus b'mitzvah. We're going to apply the principle of osek b'mitzvah, pater b'mitzvah. We're going to apply the principle of esei dochalosas, because it's be'idna. Why is it be'idna? Because he's misasek b'mitzvah, and the misasek b'mitzvah gives us the legal halachic right to extend the mitzvah to the broader definition of a mitzvah. The afal pisha dain lo gomar as a mitzvah nechshav shapir ke be'idna v'cheinu binyonenu from mitchilas habiyah nechshav likiba'idna d'mekayim Allah. So already the Tchilas Habiyah is considered osek b'mitzvah. The word Mekayim Allah, where does he get the word Mekayim Allah from? That's the... Yeah. I would cross out the word the Mekayim Allah and write Nekar Allah. In other words, already at the beginning of Biyah, it's considered as askus b'mitzvah, and it's be'inna l'me'ekar Allah, to be okir the law. Otherwise, this makes no sense. To Mekayim Allah. Or maybe it means the l'mekayim mitzvahs yibum lidchos Allah. I believe that this is emes lamito. I mean, you have to assume a broader definition of mitzvah. Otherwise, you're in trouble with many, many sugyas and shas. I'll give you one other example. This is a sugya in Makkos. The man is building a sukkah, picks up the axe to cut down the wood for his sukkah, and the head of the axe flies off and never kills him. And the Gemara says he's not chayiv what's called I forget the word anyway. He's not obligated to run to the ear mikvah. I don't know. Golos. Oh, that's sorry. Ain't no gola the ear mikvah. Why? Because it's got to be dumya de yar. Right? The Torah gave the example of two people that went into a forest, and one killed the other one, and he's chayiv golos. Says the Gemara, that's only because he's involved in a reshus. You know, he's going to the yard to cut his wood. But if he's involved in a mitzvah, like cutting the wood for his sukkah, then if he kills someone, he's not chayiv golos. What do you mean sukkah? That's called mitzvah. What do you mean mitzvah? Cutting down wood for the sukkah? But the answer is, I believe it's his askus b'mitzvah. This is already the beginning stage of building a sukkah. And it gives you a more extended definition of a mitzvah. So we have many examples where a person is... You see, I would ask another question, but this is going to throw me for a loop. It's not going to support me. In Birchas HaMitzvah, do you recite the bracha, we need overlas yasan before the Maisa Mitzvah, or even before this Askus Mitzvah? You see, we're not denying that there are two concepts. There's this Askus Mitzvah, which is separate from the actual Asiyas. what we're doing is we're upgrading the status of his askus for mitzvah vis-a-vis certain specific halachas, like esei dochalosase or osek b'mitzvah potem in a mitzvah. In that context, we can allow and define a broader definition of the mitzvah that goes beyond the Ma'aseh mitzvah and includes his askus for mitzvah. But we're not denying the distinction between his askus for mitzvah and the Ma'aseh mitzvah. The bracha would always be, like, let's say, for example, I'm taking apart my tefillin in order to put them, to don my tefillin. I would not make a bracha on the tefillin on the moment that I take apart my tefillin. I take them out of the boxes. But it could be that if an ani would come along and ask me for money, and I am now taking apart my ritzuos in such a way that now I can don my tefillin, that's already considered osek b'mitzvah. It opens up a whole, a whole Pandora's box. When am I considered osek b'mitzvah? Like the Rambam says on Leil HaSeder, you should mix the wine and dilute it so that it'll be tasty. They used to have concentrated wine. And the Rambam, when he says Ketzad Asiyas Mitzvahs Alayla in Perek Zayin, the Rambam opens up with mixing the wine. Ma'arev es hayayin. Now the mitzvah is to drink the wine, not to mix the wine. But I can't drink the wine if it's concentrated wine unless I mix it and I dilute it. So the question is whether dilution of the wine is itself called a misasik mitzvah. From the fact that Rambam says tchilas seder asiyas alayla, and the first thing he has on his list is to mix the wine, and then you recite kiddush on the first two kossos. It seems like mixing the wine is upgraded to the status of his askus b'mitzvah. Again, I'm just thinking, letting my mind, what's called free association. So I personally am very impressed by this logic of the Shara HaMelech. When you enter into the cemetery for the purpose of obtaining the lost object, that's already considered osek b'mitzvah. Such that now we can apply esei dochalosas way before he returns the object. And the Kohen is allowed to go in to the Beis HaKvaros because we're going to apply the principle of esei dochalosas. So what we're left with is the Imrei Moshe, which that will have to the Lineder cover on Yom Rishon. Okay then? I guess, Jeff, this is the last opportunity for us to say bon voyage.
Yeah, I hope so.
Hope so. And you should have a safe trip, and we'll see you, what is it, June 21st or so?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
All right. If you haven't, the trouble is that this would be in the middle of the night for you, otherwise.
Right.
Yeah. All right, all the best. Kultu.
All right, toda. Bye.
Bye.